Yes.
Okay, what about others? Can you hear me? Okay, fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me start the session. So, in today's session, we'll try to focus on creating screen elements but with backend values via OData service. So whichever screen elements we have created yesterday, the same screen elements, we are going to use it today as well, but slightly with a different technique. We are going to get data from backend system via OData service. So we'll try to focus on label with something like select screen element, that is a drop-down box. And we'll try this with backend values or dynamic values via OData service. Similarly, we'll try with label and combo box with backend values via OData service and label with multi-combo box with backend values via OData service, label with multi-inputs, and we'll try to use label with tokenizer with backend values via OData service. And then we'll try to use label with breadcrumbs. And we'll try to make use of label with radio button group. So elements which we have discussed yesterday, the same screen elements, we are going to use it today, but slightly with a different syntax. That is the only point that you need to understand. And in case if you want to get data from backend system, via OData service, then what we need to do is we need to first collect OData service details. If you are expecting data from backend system to these screen elements, you need to collect OData service details. So already I've provided OData service details just before creating that application through worklist template. Something like service name, CRUD OData project, SRV, and entity type. I've already provided these details, user and OData fields. So these are the fields we have used. And entity set is user set. So don't forget, the select query is already part of that particular OData service. So you need to collect the front-end point of view. You need to collect these details before you get data from backend system via OData service. Now, these details, you can get it from two ways. The above details, that means above OData service details, can be found under metadata.xml file. And the second one is SCGW transaction code. So last time when I shown you these details, I've shown you through SCGWT code. But after consuming that service, the same details, you will also find it in metadata.xml file. So here you can see that. So this was our project folder. Under that, there are views, models, properties file, controller, etc. And if you expand service, then you will find metadata.xml file. Every project which consumes OData service contains metadata.xml file. Any project which consumes OData service contains metadata.xml file. In your case also, you'll find this. So when you double click, you can see here, you'll get list of, you can get list of fields and the information about your OData service. Here you can see, just for knowledge purpose, I'm opening this. So metadata.xml file, we don't write any code here in this file. This is just for reference. So you can see the entity type is user. And the key field is user ID. Key field is user ID. You can notice that. And the fields, the actual fields of that service, you can see here with the data type and length, etc. So you can see these are the fields. All the fields are available in metadata.xml file if you consume a service at the time of creating a project. Now, if I scroll down, you can see here, there will be entity sets. Okay, you can see here. Under the same file, metadata.xml file. So you will also find entity sets here. Which entity sets are available inside that service? So in our case, we were using one of the entity set as user set. But there are other entity sets that we can use it later. So one of the entity set which we are trying to use is user set here. And not only that, the service name, which service you have consumed, that you can get it from here. Which service you have consumed in your project, so that is also registered inside metadata.xml file. Metadata.xml file is not for writing the code, it is just a reference file so that you can use OData service details from that file in your actual application development. So the point here is metadata.xml file, it's a reference file which contains OData service information like OData entity type, OData fields, OData entity set, and key field, which key field is part of that entity type, data type of each field, length, and service name, etc. So this type of details, you'll find it inside metadata.xml file. It's a reference file. But actual service is developed in SCGW T code. So obviously you'll get all the details here as well. So SCGW is service development tool. That means OData service development tool here. So obviously you'll find that information here as well. So in our example, as of today, we are going to use these details. The same details I was using at the time of project creation by using worklist template. But in case if you're expecting data from backend system, okay, 1 second. I think someone connected without name. Who is this? So when you try to log in to GoToMeeting, try to provide your name or email ID so that it will be easy to recognize, especially at the time of doubt session. Okay. So next time onwards, whoever is trying to log into GoToMeeting, just provide your email ID or your name. So don't give shortcut names ABC XYZ like that. Yeah. Then let me come back to the main point. So if you're trying to get data from backend system via OData service, you need to follow one pattern in the front end. So the pattern to be followed. In front end application for fetching data from backend via OData service. So most important pattern, the same pattern we have used yesterday also. But I did not give this pattern proper syntax. So today we are trying to utilize that in a detailed manner. You can see when you're using any screen element. So generally there will be a main screen element. For main screen element, we can use aggregation property. And for main screen element, there will be an internal screen element. For internal screen element, we have to use a normal property here. So let me highlight this. Main screen element with aggregation property. Main screen element can have internal screen element with its own property. So yesterday we have used select screen element. This is for drop-down box. That's a main screen element. Aggregation property we have used is items. And internal screen element we have used is item. That's the internal screen element. And property is we can use key, comma, text. That is what we have used yesterday. Similarly, we have used combo box. Combo box is a main screen element and it contains items as aggregation property. And internal screen element is again item, and you can use key, comma, text property. Of course, there are other properties, but these are the important properties. And multi-combo box, if you are using this as a main screen element with aggregation property items, item is the internal screen element. You can use key comma text property here. Similarly, we have used radio button group. We have used radio button group as a main screen element. And it contains buttons as aggregation property. You can find all these things in the documentation, but this table will help you. So radio button group contains buttons as aggregation property, and internal screen element you can use radio button. And the property here you can use is text property for radio button. Similarly, we can use multi-input. And multi-input contains suggestion items as aggregation property. Suggestion items as aggregation property. And internal screen element is item. For item, we can use key comma text property. Similarly, we can use tokenizer as a main screen element, tokens as aggregation property, token as internal screen element, and text is an important property of that, token. Similarly, we can use breadcrumbs. That's a main screen element, and it contains links as aggregation property. And internal screen element is link. For link, we can use text comma href properties. These are the two important properties of link. So this is what we have used yesterday. The same things we are going to use today as well, but instead of hard coding the values, we are going to get data from backend system via OData service. And in the coming days, we are going to use list screen element. Most important, list screen element, and list screen element contains items as aggregation property. The internal screen element is standard list item. You can use standard list item or object list item. You can use any option. There will be difference in properties. You can use standard list item as internal screen element or object list item as internal screen element. Only properties will be different. So for standard list item, what we can do is we can use title, description, and counter, then info. These are the main properties of standard list item: title, description, info, and counter. So this we are going to discuss in the next session mostly. And not only list, there is one more important screen element, there is table. So table also contains items as aggregation property. Table is a main screen element with items as aggregation property. For table, we can use any internal screen element. For table, we can use any internal screen element. For example, you can use text or input, image or slider, etc. So the internal screen element depends on your requirement. Table can have any internal screen element depending upon your requirement, and depending upon the screen element, the property is decided. So property depends on screen element which you use. If you are using text screen element, then you have to use text property. If you're using input, you have to use value property. Image, SRC property. Slider, value property. So the point is, depending upon the internal screen element, the property is decided here. So in detail, we are going to discuss this. What type of internal screen element we can add, what type of properties we can provide. Those things we'll discuss when we start the table screen element. But as far as today's session is concerned, according to this pattern, we can use any screen element here, and the property depends on the screen element which you use. Not only table, we can use microchart. We can use microchart, that's a main screen element, and it has data as aggregation property. For microchart, you can use data as aggregation property. And okay, internal screen element can be microchart data. Internal screen element can be microchart data here. For microchart data, we use text for x-axis. This is for x-axis. And we are going to use value, that is for y-axis. So charts, here microcharts contains two options, x-axis and y-axis. On internal screen element microchart data, we can use text for representing x-axis. We can use value for representing y-axis. And not only that, there will be charts. Charts are different, microcharts are different. Charts are for simple graphical format. Microcharts are for simple graphical format. But there is other concept like charts. For charts, what we do is we use data as aggregation property. And we are going to use dimension definition. Dimension definition, that is for x-axis. As internal screen element, we use dimension definition. And internal screen element, we can use measure definition, that is for y-axis. So one is for x-axis, another is for y-axis. So one main screen element can have two internal screen elements. Dimension definition, measure definition. These are two internal screen elements for charts. Dimension definition represents x-axis, measure definition represents y-axis. And internal screen element, dimension definition will use value property for representing x-axis. And measure definition also will use value property for representing y-axis data. So these are the most important and very commonly used in all types of various Fiori applications. The backend can be anything, but the front-end behavior remains the same. Front-end pattern, front-end screen elements, the properties, all those things remain same irrespective of the backend service, irrespective of the backend system. So now what we need to do here is okay, so if you closely observe this, okay, so this is our pattern which we need to follow. But in this pattern, there is one important thing. So when you are expecting data from backend system, what we do is on aggregation property, On aggregation property, what we do is we maintain or we configure entity set of OData service. Because entity set contains what? Entity set contains collection of records when service is executed. So that entity set you need to configure to the aggregation property of main screen element. So we have to configure entity set because entity set holds collection of records at runtime. So configure entity set here. Why we have to configure entity set? Because entity set holds collection of records at runtime. So that entity set has to be configured for aggregation property. So that's a main point that you need to understand here. And not only that, on internal screen element properties. On internal screen element properties, what we can do is we can configure OData fields, or we call it as maintaining data binding. You can call it as, in simple words, you can call it as configuring OData fields. But configuring OData fields is nothing but maintaining data binding with OData fields. Instead of configuring, we are calling it as data binding. So data binding is a technical word. So data binding has to be maintained with OData fields for internal screen element properties. So this is what we need to do here. So whether it is table, drop-down checkbox or whatever, but ultimately for aggregation property, we can maintain relation with entity set. For internal screen element properties, we can maintain data binding with OData fields. So let me just write this simple note. Let me save it. Pattern to be followed for screen elements to fetch data from backend via OData service. So instead of searching in the documentation, just remember this diagram. 80% of the applications will use these particular screen elements very commonly. So instead of searching in the documentation, you can just refer this pattern. Now, as a note, let me write here. So the above pattern is applicable for all types of OData services. Please remember that. It can be OData ABAP service, or it can be OData HANA-based CDS service, or OData external service. It doesn't matter which service you are consuming, but this pattern is same. There is no change. So that means this pattern is applicable for all types of services. And not only that, to fetch and display backend data in front-end app via OData service. So what we need to do is, as a developer, we configure entity set of OData service to an aggregation property. of main screen element. Most important, to fetch and display backend data in front-end app via OData service. As a developer, we configure entity set of OData service to the aggregation property of main screen element. And not only that, we maintain data binding. We maintain data binding relationship with OData field. That's a relationship with OData field to internal screen element property. We maintain data binding with OData field to the property of internal screen element. So these two things that you need to follow and remember whenever you fetch data from backend and display data in the front end via OData service. So let us try some of these things. Up to here, let me try for today's session. Up to breadcrumbs. List table charts, microcharts we'll discuss in the coming days. Now, first let me try with select screen element, that is drop-down box with backend values. So how to implement that code? So here you can see, hello students, can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Can one of you confirm?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, fine. So here, let me start the coding part. So let me directly go to object view. We were writing the code in object view from the beginning. So object view, we have created screen elements like this. Yesterday also we have used select screen element, combo box, radio button group, multi-combo box, multi-input, tokenizer, and breadcrumbs. The same screen elements I'll be repeating here, but with backend data. So first let me take one label here. And I want to use text direction and design. So text, let me make it like select, for example, first name. Now, I want to make use of this one. Select as a main screen element with items as aggregation property. So we can use select here. So that's a class from sap.m library. So this is a main screen element. Select is a main screen element. So you should use begin tag, end tag. That is mandatory. Yesterday also I have highlighted that point. So select screen element is a main screen element. So there should be a begin tag, end tag. That's mandatory. Now on main screen element, items is aggregation property. So when you're expecting data from backend, you need to use aggregation property like this here, items, and configure entity set of OData service. And width is a common property. You can use it. For example, 250 pixels. So items is aggregation property. Ultimately, we have to maintain relation with entity set. And the internal screen element is item class. So you can use core item. And this item is a class available under SAP UI core library. SAP UI core library, we have declared with core as a prefix earlier. So that's the reason why we are using core as a prefix to use the class from that library. Item is a class from SAP UI core library. You can see that. And it contains one property, key and text. So for key, what we can do is we can maintain data binding with OData field. And there is text property. Text is for display purpose. And for text property also, you can use flower brackets and maintain data binding with OData field. Another OData field. So this is the approach we have to follow. But yesterday what we have done is we have used n number of items with static values. Instead of using n number of items with static values, just you need to maintain data binding with OData field here. So yesterday what we have done here, you can see. We have used select items as aggregation property, and we have used item class with key and text. But yesterday we were dealing with static values. For static values, you have to create n number of items like this. Hard-coded items, hard-coded values we are using here. I've used 7 to 8 items here because they are hard-coded. The values are not coming from backend in yesterday's scenario. But in today's scenario, what we're trying to do is we're getting data from backend. So just use one single core item with key and text. Data comes from backend if you maintain data binding with OData field here in this case. Now, the number of items, say suppose if entity set contains 10 records, then 10 items are internally generated. If entity set contains 15 records, then 15 items are generated in the front end automatically. So the point here is, depending upon the number of records in entity set, those many items are generated in the front end automatically. If entity set contains 20 records, then 20 items are internally generated in the front end. Because we are configuring entity set and we are maintaining data binding. So in our case, the entity set is user set. Look, let me write it here. Entity set holds collection of records. So just to remind you, at runtime. So in our case, entity set is user set. So you can use it here. User set. And one of the field is user ID, another field is first name. You can use any field, it all depends on the service and the fields which you want to use. So one of the field is user ID, another field is first name. Let me use it as it is here in data binding. And first name. So data binding has to be used within flower brackets. If you don't use flower brackets, it is not going to work. Data binding always happens in flower brackets. And when you're configuring entity set, also you should use flower brackets. They are nothing but placeholders. Now, okay, let me explain this here. Okay, first let me run this. If it is working, then I'll explain that syntax. Let me go to second screen. So in second screen, here you can see the last screen element here just now created as a drop down that's a select screen element, and all these values are coming from backend system via OData service. So user can select any value here. And the selected value we can capture by writing code in event handler in the coming days. So the values are coming from backend system here via OData service because we are configuring entity set, we are maintaining data binding. Okay, so let me explain one syntax here once again. Most important for all the coming days, all the coming sessions. So, okay, let me close this. Let me copy these lines into a notepad, paint file. So here, right, so let me just highlight this. The same pattern we are going to follow for all the coming screen elements as well. So the main screen element is select in this case. Items is the aggregation property. Configure with entity set of OData service here within flower brackets. That is important. And core item, that's an internal screen element here. And key comma text, these are the properties of internal screen element. Key comma text, these are the properties of internal screen element. For internal screen element properties, we establish data binding relation with OData fields. So these are some of the things that you need to remember. Okay, let me highlight here. So main screen element, and items in this case is the aggregation property. It's an aggregation property of that main screen element. And entity set is user set in this case. Configure entity set. Why? Because it contains collection of records. And entity set we are configuring to collect data and display data. So we are collecting data from backend and displaying data in front end. Configure entity set, that is to collect data from backend and display data in the front end. Very simple. Now, if entity set contains 10 records, 10 items are internally generated in the front end application. If entity set is holding 100 records, 100 items are internally generated. So just remember that note. And you can see this is the internal screen element here, item. This is an internal screen element. And not only internal screen element contains properties. So here we are trying to establish data binding relationship with OData fields. So what we are trying to do here is we are trying to establish data binding relationship with OData fields. So maintain data binding with OData fields to property of internal screen element. So almost I've repeated 3 to 4 times. I hope you got some clarity now. So this, you can consider this as a main syntax. Just remember this diagram. Based on this diagram, most of the screen elements you can create in your Fiori applications. Whether it is standard application or custom application, whether it is OData ABAP service or HANA service, it doesn't matter, but this syntax remains same. Whether you use Web ID tool or Business Application Studio, ultimately this syntax remains same. So let me save this. Overview of main screen element and internal screen element with properties. So this is very, very important. Just remember this. Now let me try another option here. Okay, first let me copy these lines. So what you can do is you can implement below code. Now let me try with another screen element, combo box, of course, with backend values via OData service. So what we can do is we can implement some piece of code here. Implement below code. So let me try here in Web ID. First, let me take label. Let me copy this label. Okay, let it be first name. So here, I want to use combo box. It's from SAP.m library. And this is a main screen element, so there should be a begin tag, end tag. Main screen element should have begin tag, end tag. And as I told you, combo box contains items as aggregation property. So why don't you use that? Items. Configure with entity set by using flower brackets. And width is a common property. You can use, for example, 250 pixels. And internal screen element is item. In this case, item class belongs to core package, and it contains key as well as text. So here also what we need to do, use flower brackets. Within double quotes, use flower brackets and use OData field in data binding. Use OData field in data binding. Very simple. So for key and text property, we can establish data binding. So in our case, let me use, for example, user ID and text field as first name. And entity set is user set in our case. So let me try this output. Observe the last screen element here. You can see there is combo box. Combo box is also fetching data from backend system via OData service. So user can select a value. User can select a value from this list, or user can enter a new value, XYZ or ABC. So user can enter a new value, or user can select the backend value in this case. So that all depends. That's a specialty of combo box. And this is a code that's working fine. So let me use this here in a node file. Now let me try with multi-combo box here. So for multi-combo box, we follow the same pattern by implementing below code. So first, let me take that same label. And here, I want to make use of multi-combo box. This is a class from SAP.m library. So multi-combo box, use begin tag, end tag, because it's a main screen element. And for multi-combo box, items is aggregation property, item is an internal screen element, key and text is a property of internal screen element. So let us use the same approach here. Items with entity set. And you can use width, that's a very common property here. Core item is an internal screen element. We can use key comma text here once again. So use flower brackets within double quotes, that is important. And the OData field names are case sensitive. When you are using the OData field names, you can just open metadata.xml file. So whatever field is available here, the same field name as it is, by following case sensitive rule, try to use it in your coding. So here also you can use OData field and double quotes, flower brackets, OData field 2. Now, as I told you, entity set in our case is user set. You can try this. And OData field is user ID. Let me use second field as first name. So let me select it and run this. So here you can see the last screen element. There is multi-combo box. For multi-combo box, the values are coming from backend system via OData service. Now what user can do is user can select multiple values here. User can select multiple values in this case. That's the only specialty of multi-combo box. You can increase the width so that you can see all the values which are selected. And every value is coming from backend, but each value contains a checkbox here. It contains checkbox. You can see that. So it allows multiple selections. Very simple. And whatever values are selected, we can capture by writing code in event handler when we go for controller part. Now, this is a code that is working fine, so let me use it here. Now let me try with another screen element, multi-inputs with backend values via OData service. So I can implement below code. So first let me take the same label. Now here, I want to make use of multi-input. So that's also from SAP.m library. Use begin tag, end tag because I want to use this as a main screen element. Now for multi-input, according to our pattern, multi-input contains suggestion items as aggregation property. So try with items. If it is working fine, it's okay. Try with items. If it is working fine, it's okay. If it is not working, then compulsory you have to use suggestion items. So suggestion items, according to me, suggestion items is an aggregation property which will work. I've used items, but it's not working. So suggestion items, and here for suggestion items, use entity set and provide some width. Now the internal screen element, suggestion items also supports internal screen element as item. So let me try that. Item is a class from SAP UI core package, but it contains key and text properties. So here use OData field and second OData field. So in our case, entity set is user set. And OData field, let me try with same user ID and first name for data binding. There is some problem, let me check. Okay, there is some problem here.
You entered after the quotes.
Okay, double quotes.
Line number.
Double quotes wrongly placed. Okay, now I've corrected it. So let me run this again. So you can see now the last screen element multi-input. So if I type something like A, so you can see list of values starting with A, they are displayed here. You can see that. If I use something like K, then you can see list of values starting with K, they are displayed here. Or something like R, then list of values starting with R, they are displayed here. So you can see that. So ultimately, this also allows multiple selections here. Multi-input also allows multiple selections, but user need to enter the starting letter here. For example, D. You can see that. Right, so this is how it works. Multi-input, suggestion items, item, and key comma text. So it is working fine. So let me copy this, our note file. Okay, then one more screen element. Let me try with tokenizer. I think, yeah, first we'll try with tokenizer with backend values via OData service. So to do this, you can implement below code. All these lines we are writing inside the simple form concept. We have created simple form as a container. In that container, we started writing all these lines. So don't forget that. So within the simple form, we are writing all these lines. So first, let me take this label. And I want to make use of tokenizer. Tokenizer, I think it is not mainly for selection, it is for displaying the values. So tokenizer class from SAP.m library. It's a main screen element in this scenario. So use begin tag, end tag. Now for tokenizer, I can say tokens is aggregation property. Token is an internal screen element. So tokens. So that's an aggregation property. So definitely you can use entity set. Bit, I think it's not mandatory. And the internal screen element is token. Token and tokenizer, both are from same library, SAP.m library. So let me use token. And token contains text property. Here, I just want to use OData field. Let me check, is there any other property? Key is also available. If you want, you can use that. You can see that. Key property, text property. If you want, you can use key. But ultimately here, data binding with OData field has to be maintained. So let me change this entity set to user set. OData field as something like user ID. OData field first name. Save it, and you can run this. Tokenizer with token. So here you can see, if you closely observe, these are the values that are displayed in this case as tokens. And all these values are coming from backend system via OData service. All these values are coming from backend system via OData service. So the tokenizer will display the values like this. It is mainly for display purpose. I don't think it is for selection. Okay, let me copy these lines. Now, let me try with breadcrumbs. With backend values via OData service. So you can implement below code. So let me open web ID. So here first, let me take the label. Can I have a label? And now we are trying to use breadcrumbs. So breadcrumbs is a class from SAP.m library. Let me use that. And we are going to use this as a main screen element. So you should have begin tag, end tag. For breadcrumbs, according to our pattern, you can see breadcrumbs contains links as aggregation property and link as an internal screen element. Text href is a property of internal screen element. So you can use that here. Links. So entity set is required. And here internal screen element is link, but link is a class from SAP.m library. You can see this. So link, you can use text property here. And you can maintain data binding with OData field. If you want, you can use other properties. So in our case, entity set is user set. So this approach you have to use /user set. Now, say suppose if you're getting data from some other service, then what we do is we just use like this. Model 2. Something like this. OData model 2. Then use /entity set. Then the data will come from the second service in this case. That is the approach we are going to follow. And in OData field also, we use OData model 2 greater than OData field name. This is syntax we have to use. So this OData field comes from the second OData service. So we are going to provide the model name before entity set and before OData field. In case if you are expecting data from second service or third service. Now by default, we have consumed one service that is a default service and the main service in this application. For main service, you need not use model name. For main service, you need not use any model name. You can directly provide entity set field, entity set and the OData field directly. Let me repeat this point. In case if you're expecting data from some other service, that model has to be provided. Greater than / entity set. And second model, OData model 2 greater than OData field. So the point here is the data need not come from same service every time. It can come from different services. It all depends. But 99% of the applications in Fiori will get the complete data from one service. Whatever functionalities you want to write, you write it in one service and use that service in the front end. That is a recommended approach. Right, so let me go to the single service as of now. OData field, let me use, for example, first name. We'll try to use second service also in the coming days, don't worry. Let me run this. And here, observe the last screen element. In this case, you can see there are some hyperlinks. Each first name, all these names are coming from backend, but these are displayed as hyperlinks. You can provide some event handler to this hyperlink. But that event handler you'll understand only when we go for controller part. As of now, we are just displaying each name as a hyperlink because of breadcrumbs. And if there are more values, I think you'll get a drop down like this. If there are more values which are not fitting the screen, then you'll get a drop down initially at the beginning of the first value. You can see that. Okay, so that's how you can use breadcrumbs. Now, one more screen element, that is radio button group. I think this is the last screen element for today. Radio button group also supports backend values via OData service. So you can implement below code. So first, let me take one label. Label, that's a very common thing. So now I want to use radio button group. So you can see radio button group is a class from SAP.m library. I want to use this as a main screen element. So main screen element should have begin tag, end tag. And not only that, you can see, radio button group. Radio button group contains buttons. Buttons as the aggregation property according to the documentation. So you can use buttons and buttons. And then here you can see that's the aggregation property. So we have to use entity set here. Now the internal screen element is radio button. So radio button, let me use that. It's also from SAP.m library. And radio button, the main property is text property. So we can use that here. And for internal screen element property, you have to maintain data binding with OData field. So entity set, in our case, it is user set. OData field is, for example, first name. As of now, let me use this field. Very simple. And if you want, you can have, okay, first let me run this. So you can scroll down, and if you scroll down the last screen element here, you can see the list of radio buttons. They're displayed like this. There are too many values, so you're getting all the values from the backend, and each value is represented as radio button here. You can see that. But I want to split it into multiple columns. This is by default displayed as a single column, but I want to split it into multiple columns. So yesterday, I've already told you, you can use radio button group with columns. Columns, you can see that's one of the property. So I want to use, for example, 6 columns. Save it. The same values which comes from backend, they're splitted into 6 columns according to this code now. So here you can see, now the radio buttons are available and the number of columns they're taken as 6 here. So you can notice that all these things here, there are 6 columns here. But the values are coming from backend system via OData service. There is no doubt in that because we are configuring entity set and we are maintaining data binding. So user can select any value. The selected value we can capture by writing code in event handler. Okay, so that code is working fine. So let me use this. Okay, so that's how you can use radio button group, and radio button group contains columns. By default is 1. But if you want, you can use 6, 7 or whatever. If there are too many values, you can increase the number of columns. Okay, so in the next session, what we'll do is we'll try to go with list, screen element, table, chart, microchart, etc. Most important screen elements. But what is the difference between the last session and today's session? Let me explain so that those who missed it last session, they can also easily recollect it. So, for example, let me take this one. For example, radio button group. So this is the code we have used in today's session. So this is for backend values from OData service. Those values we're displaying as radio button group here. Now the same code we have used in the last session with this approach. Here also we have used it. Columns, etc. And radio button group, there should be end tag. That is also used in the last session like this. But the main point is when you are dealing with static values, don't use this syntax. Don't use like this here for static values. So for static values, what we do is we use the same aggregation property. But we don't maintain data binding with entity set. So what we need to do is try to use the same property here as buttons, as a separate tag. Buttons as separate tag. And end tag. So that means in static values also we are using aggregation property. There is no doubt, but we are using it as a separate tag here, and we can avoid this. When you're dealing with static values. This is enough. Now, here, when you're dealing with backend system values via OData service, we are using only single radio button. For backend values, we are using single radio button as an internal screen element with data binding with OData field. But here, when you're dealing with static values, then what you need to do is you need to use n number of radio buttons here. Property is same, screen element, internal screen element is same, everything is same, but instead of maintaining data binding with OData field, what we need to do is we can hard code the value. For example, Ajay. And I want to have some list of static values. So you can increase the number of radio buttons here. Something like this. So that's a difference between the last session and today's session. Those who missed last session, please try to compare this and try to proceed further. So this approach for dynamic values coming from backend, and this approach is for static values. This is with backend values via OData service. And right side syntax, this is with static values, no backend interaction. Now, here, when you're getting data from backend system, the number of radio buttons will be created depending upon the number of records coming from entity set of that service. So in backend values approach also, there will be n number of radio buttons, but the number of radio buttons are created based on the number of records available in entity set here. If entity set contains 6 records, then 6 radio buttons are created here also. So depending upon the number of records coming from entity set, those many radio buttons are generated. But in case of static values, you have to hard code each radio button with a value. You have to hard code each value in your coding. So that's the main difference. Please notice that. But here also we are having, ultimately here also we are having internal screen element. Okay, let me highlight that simple point. The number of radio buttons depends on number of records. Of number of records available in entity set of OData service. That is one simple point you need to notice here. The number of radio buttons depends on the number of records available in entity set if you are expecting data from backend system via OData service. Just remember that. But here, as a developer, we have to hard code every radio button separately when you're dealing with static values. So you take any screen element. You can take any screen element, combo box, select screen element for drop down, multi-combo box, multi-input, the same pattern is followed. And the same differences are applicable. So let me save this difference between static values technique and backend values technique. So just remember this. Now, if you have any doubts, you can ask me.
Vijay, Ravi here.
Yeah, Ravi, what's your doubt?
Vijay, let us say I have created one OData service with 5 entity sets, and I created a Fiori template sample app. So later on, I have a requirement to add few more entity sets. By that time, metadata XML is registered with the existing entity sets, right? If I add more entity sets in backend OData service, at what point of time our program will recognize there are extra entity sets are added?
No, the thing is, you can have a number of entity sets. The only thing is, only for initial service, the metadata is generated here. Are you getting my point? Only
Yes,
for
yes.
initial service, the metadata is generated. But at later point of time, you can add anything here. What you can do is you can right click and what you can do is you can change this. Okay, let me go to manifest file. Yeah. So manifest file, you can add a service. You can remove this service and add a new service, then automatically it will detect that. Are you getting my point? And
Yes.
whatever field you have added in your backend SCGW, that field you can directly use it in your coding.
Okay, it's need not to be registered in metadata, right? As you said, Vijay.
Metadata.xml file will be updated when you go for this. When you remove that service and when you re-add that service. Are you getting my point?
Yeah,
So
got it.
Z7AM CRUD OData project SRV, right? This is a service. You try to remove that and try to re-add that. The file will be generated according to the latest service. Here you can see. So these are correlated. Here you can see there's a project name. For that, there is a metadata.xml file. So if you remove this and if you add that service once again, then the latest fields are also will be reflected in metadata.xml file. Okay.
Okay, Vijay. Vijay, another question. We are displaying the values in like let us say radio button, or like I have a requirement like there are two drop down. One is country, another one is state. If I select country as a India, so I wanted to display only related that particular related state. So it's a condition based drop down, right? Vijay?
Then yes, we can do that. So based on